Good morning. Courtney Desabay from the Office of the CFO. I'm going to do the FY20 Budget Development Update. All right, so we're going to go through four things. So first, the General Fund Preliminary Revenue Update, the FSF allocations, the per pupil changes, and then where we are in the process, the next steps. So up first, we have the General Fund Revenue comparison from fiscal year 19 to fiscal year 20. This is the preliminary fiscal year 20 numbers. As you can see, the state numbers are fairly flat from what we received last year. The local number is exactly the same. There's a slight decrease in federal, which is expected from E-rate, and the other revenue expected to stay the same. Next slide, we have the school FSF allocations. So this combines two different sorts of funding. This is the base funding that schools receive, as well as the weighted funding, and this is the combination of those two things. So we have side-by-side comparisons from the post-enrollment adjustment numbers last year. I will say the post-enrollment adjustment numbers are different from what you voted on in the spring, as is normally the case. When we do the enrollment adjustment process in the fall, if there are changes in enrollment or there are other updates in the funding formula, those get updated at that point in time. And usually what we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years, because of the decline in enrollment, the fall numbers are actually a little bit lower than the spring numbers. So what that means is that you tend to have a slightly higher base per pupil because you're dividing the same amount of money by fewer kids, and changes some of the allocations from the spring to the fall. So these, on the left, you have the fall numbers, the post-enrollment adjustment numbers, and on the right, you have the proposed fiscal year 20 spring numbers. And we can see some of the variations in the funding weights. The dollar amount stayed the same. The only changes are just based on the number of students that qualified for the different weights. And that's what affected the totals. The next slide here, we have the per pupil changes that are proposed currently. So the fiscal year 19 final charter per pupil was $9,002. The current proposed fiscal year 20 charter per pupil is $9,108, an increase of $106. On the traditional side, the fiscal year 19 final was $5,543. The proposed number now is $5,590, an increase of $47 per pupil. And this is just the base. Sorry, you look like you had a question. Or no? Oh, okay, sorry. All right. Timeline updates. School budgets were initially released on February 4th. The school budget tool went live on February 13th. That is slightly later than we had originally planned. The budget tool was supposed to go live on February 8th, but we had made some adjustments. The school collaborative started last week Friday. They're actually taking place right now as well. They're in room 301. So we have all the schools coming in. They come in from 8:30 to 5, pretty much every day, weather permitting, between now and March 1st. So every school comes in, whether traditional, charter, or otherwise. They have their support team. We've discussed this before, where you have Title I, special education, human capital, finance. Everyone's in the room sitting at the table with them while they build their budget. Every school is expected to leave the table with their budget balanced. In the instances where they're still waiting on outstanding information or there's still something else to be done, we're giving a period of 2 days, 2 school days, working days, for them to finalize whatever it is that's required so that they can submit their finalized budget. And those go through March 1st. Like I said, they're taking place. They started the first group on Friday, and we have a few of them in here right now taking place today. And then central office budgeting is underway. Cabinet meetings are taking place today and tomorrow as well to go through some of the central office budgeting, and we expect that to be completed by March 1st as well. All right. Any questions?
You have a question about the charter funding. One is, are there any additional fees for service like there was in a previous budget related to police services? I don't remember where that ended up. I know there was some ruling at the state. And secondly, can you just sort of explain why it is that charter per pupil has gone up $100? And what was the amount? Sorry, hold on a second. Went up about $100, and then traditional up $47. Why does that happen?
So the first one on the police fees, I think that's still an outstanding issue. I think there was a ruling stating that we could, I think as structured, it could not be charged, but I think that's going through a review process and a feedback process. I still don't know where that's going to end up. With regards,
the fiscal year 20 budget does not assume anything like that at this point.
At this point, I think it's still undecided.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
For the change in charter formulas, for the change in funding formulas, those two are completely independent. So the charter formula changes are due largely to the enrollment decrease on the charter side. So you have fewer students on the charter side, which is we're seeing because a lot of the closures that we voted on just passed are affecting charter schools, in addition to the overall enrollment decline in the district. So that's one of the factors affecting there. And there are a few changes in some of the other exclusions in the formula. For example, and these kind of work both ways, we're increasing ESOL funding, which is one of the exclusions. There's a slight change in like pre-K funding, so the formula changes based on those aspects, whereas the traditional funding formula is completely separate. It's based on the available funding and it's allocated based on the number of students. So those kind of operate independently. We do see the percentage fairly similar in this case, but it's not intentional. So the charter for pupil went up by about 1.1% or so. The traditional went up by about 0.8% or so.
And is there,
I think other thing to keep in mind with regard to the two formulas is that on the traditional side too, the traditional formula is more a combination of cash and services. So there's also been an increase in some of the services
Okay.
that traditional schools have received. So that partly explains the difference.
that's helpful. And is there any contingency built in for any of the charters that were voted to be closed or successful in any appeals that they might have to remain open?
We have some thoughts or some plans on how we could implement that, but we can't really hold money aside for those. We still have to assign the funds, district-wide to the rest of the schools. But we do have some plans in terms of how we can deal with that if there is a case where those are overturned. We had a similar incident last year with Banneker Blake, where initially, they were supposed to be closed, and we had processed them to be closed. And we found out after the budget was already put out that we had to go and fund those schools, so we did have to kind of rearrange things a bit for that. So it is something that we're working on. I will say it's not very definitive, especially depending on how many of those decisions are overturned. It could be, it could take some time for us to work out the details on that.
Thanks.
All right.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Jacinta Hughes, Director of Transportation.
Robin Marshall, Assistant Director of Transportation.
For some reason, I'm having a little bit more trouble this morning hearing, so if you could just speak a little bit louder, maybe there's something.
Sure.
The fan or something, yeah.
Okay. The clicker.
So for the overview of OPT, the topics that we'll cover are students transported and why, safety improvements, audit recommendations, transportation workgroup, policy and regulations, ongoing improvements, as well as next steps. So with students transported and why, this is a snapshot comparing this year to last year, where we were and where we are with the number of students we transport. Just an FYI, the swing space, corner to corner, and MTA numbers are all estimates. The MTA number is the number of eligible riders, but that number could be less.
We're still having trouble hearing.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
All right.
Go ahead.
I'll try to elevate it as much as possible. So, all right. So for safety improvements, we filled all of our safety office vacancies. So we had some openings, some positions that were open for quite some time, which made it harder for us to have ample number of trainings as well as accident coverage. So those positions are now filled. And
I'm sorry.
Sure.
There's a lot of data there, and I didn't know if you had any questions about it. But I asked this question last year, and it was sort of an uncomfortable, awkward question to ask. But I'm curious, how often do you kind of audit the students that are benefiting from this transportation, some of which is required or mandated by federal law, to ensure that they are in fact meeting the criteria that provides them with this transportation. So IEP, homeless, and others, how often are you actually going through and determining that, in fact, either through a sample basis that these students are entitled to these services?
So these students are vetted by, well, it starts at the school level. They are vetted by area approvers. So, for instance, a student receiving transportation under homeless is vetted by the homeless office, and then once they come to transportation to be approved, we look at distance, we look at different factors to determine whether or not these students should indeed receive transportation. Sometimes we don't have enough information to actually reject a transportation request, but we do look at these students to see if anything stands out for reasons why that they should not be routed.
The other question, I think, at some point, maybe not now, I am curious, given some sort of changes in the way taxi service is provided or point-to-point service is provided, whether or not there's ever been given any thought to allowing some of these competitors to actual taxis bid on and participate in the kind of point-to-point service that these kids are entitled to.
So the taxi cab contract goes out to bid within the next 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And so we did explore the possibilities of like Uber and Lyft, but then we have a bigger concern of safety for our students. We're not able to validate the drivers. So the taxi cab drivers are screened the same way our yellow bus drivers are. So the issues with Uber and Lyft that we found was we would not be able to get a set pool of drivers that we would be able to screen and ensure that the background's cleared, the drug and alcohol testing. So that's been one of our limits to exploring other options of the competitors for taxi cabs.
That makes a lot of sense. I wonder if those companies would be willing to conform, particularly to meet whatever criteria that the school board had or state or federal regulations were in order to participate in something like maybe under their current structure they couldn't, but maybe for an opportunity to provide services to the district, maybe they would change their policies and practices for that purpose. I wonder if have you found that Uber or Lyft has provided these services anywhere else in the state or country that have replaced or competed directly with taxi services?
So we did look at, I want to say Philadelphia explored it, but it didn't work well. They
Okay.
went back to the taxi cabs.
Okay.
So I talked to that director in Philly. So we kind of left that street in procurement just for all of the safety precautions around it. And because the Uber drivers are not mandated to drive or perform that work. So the problem is getting, I guess, the driver to commit and dedicate to a regular schedule, which is kind of some of the reasons why we don't always use the MTA mobility, because the MTA mobility for our other students is not dedicated that we can put it on a bell time, for example.
Right. Is the RFP drafted?
Yes,
Could you share that with us? I'd like to see it.
yes.
Thanks.
Okay, so back to the safety improvements. We mentioned that we filled all vacancies. One thing that helped us do is enforce the post-accident and behind-the-wheel driver evaluation more thoroughly. Also, we updated our training materials, so we were using the same training materials for some years now, and we were able to get our hands on some nationally renowned driver training materials that's actually improved the training that the drivers and aides receive. And with the additional staff, we are able to vet and notify at-risk drivers on the brink of disqualification more thoroughly as well. And the Office of Pupil Transportation is conducting drug and alcohol post-accident testing on site, which is something we have not done in the past. On the next slide, for audit recommendations, there were a few recommendations. The ones we highlighted here are invoice, contract and monitoring, drug and alcohol testing, as well as timely reporting. So the improvements that we've made on on these topics are, one was hire additional staff to review and approve billed services, increase assessment of liquidated damages more thoroughly, and for an example, approximately $89,000 has been recovered from yellow bus and cab vendors to date. So liquidated damages is something that we've always had, but with a lack of staff was unable to enforce heavily. Under contract and monitoring, so we're starting to do like a contractor report card. So we sent letters detailing the expectations that we have on the actual contractors. We also sent surveys to the schools to report how their service has been throughout the year. And we started mid-year and end-of-year contractor evaluations, kind of like we do with BCPS employees. But we're evaluating the contractors and giving them grades bi-yearly. So we started administering drug and alcohol tests on taxi cab drivers. That is not a recommendation. That is not a requirement, but that was a recommendation from the audit team. So we started doing that, and that's helped us improve help us ensure that we're being as safe as possible. And we've also exceeded the USDOT random drug and alcohol testing requirements. And submitted all reports to MSDE by the required date. And in the past, we have been late on some of those because of staffing. We've also conducted a transportation work group throughout this past year. Work group participants, CCAP, Public Justice Center, city schools, administrators, families, MSDE, and other stakeholders. So some of the topics covered were an overview of yellow bus and specialized transportation. So since we had all of these different parties in the room, we gave them an overview of how transportation works here in Baltimore City, and we solicited their feedback and opinions based on the districts that they come from. And also supporting the education of homeless students. So the number of homeless students that we transport seems to rise year to year, so we leverage the folks that were in the room to get their take on how it's been affecting them and their districts. I said that we leverage the input of other districts to see how they've been dealing with the rising number of homeless eligible transportation students. So program
And what did you learn from that?
We learned that it is not just an issue here, but it is an issue nationwide. And some things that we learned as far as routing those students is that we have to get a little more creative, because a homeless student could be 20, 26, 27 miles from the school, or it could be 10 miles. But because of location, we can't recommend which school they go to based on their what's the term?
Their address?
No. Their basically their original school they were going to.
Oh, school of origin.
School of origin. That's what I'm looking for.
So part of it, they have to return to their school of origin. So we did develop a strong relationship with our homeless liaisons here, where they have been encouraging parents in the best interest of just not having a child have transportation for 4 hours of the day, to kind of relocate the student to their new address. But it's still a challenge. And one of the things that we did learn is taxi cabs are growing throughout the United States in transportation to transport the homeless students because of the bus driver shortage. So your resources are kind of limited to placing them on a yellow bus because of the distance that's being traveled.
In terms of the work group, so I know that John is working on pulling together the recommendations from that group. Do you have an estimate of when we would have a kind of final reports that the board could see in terms of the recommendations from the group?
Good morning. John Lane, Executive Director of Operations. Excuse me. Good morning, John Land, Executive Director of Operations. So we have a draft report. There's still one more recommendation to develop. So I'm thinking probably about a month to a month and a half.
What is the scope of the work group?
So the scope of the work group was in the Senate bill to analyze and to pull a work group together to look at the financial improvements that can be made in transportation, to consider best practices and what other jurisdictions are doing, get some outside perspective on what we can do to improve our financial situation in transportation. And what we found through the conversations is just a lot of very difficult and complex situations that we have to handle in transportation that are identical to Carroll County, Montgomery County, Baltimore County. It's just a level of resources available to be able to manage those things. We also looked at, what we can do to improve our contract compliance. So we have we made some changes to the contract. Things that we've talked about in the work group we've already implemented, and we have a contract monitoring of the invoicing policy that we put in place, or procedures that we've put in place that have yielded some good results for us so far. But the scope of the work group was to look at the finances, which was a lot of the conversations expanded beyond that as well.
Well, it was also quality of service too. So it was
Yes.
a combination, and it was
Yes.
it was part of our financial recovery plan that was required in the year that we got the additional funding from the state. We had to identify certain steps we would take, and one of the ones that was Delegate Learman suggested that we do is engage in this kind of work with outside folks to help advise us on how we could look at potential cost savings and also improvements of service in our transportation.
Yeah, that's terrific. Look forward to seeing the recommendations. I'm curious, under the first bullet, slide 6, whether the other stakeholders includes private businesses that are also experienced in transportation. Looks like what you've listed are mostly nonprofits or government entities. Or are there other experts?
We had a transportation engineer from the private sector that sat in on the group and
I know that
participate.
operations went through something similar. They had a lot of people from the outside. And why I'm sure the recommendation is going to be terrific, but why there wasn't an effort to include more people from the private sector who either run transportation businesses or are familiar with transportation operations?
So I think in this case that a lot of the work of transportation and for a school district is fairly different, and we did include one private sector representative, but then as John said, we had other folks who have lead transportation efforts in other jurisdictions where they, have frankly a lot more resources. What we identified really is that a lot of it is a resource difference in terms of the resources they have to put towards it. But in terms of the services, it's similar. I think, in transportation, the feeling was that a lot of the regulations that you have to handle, the challenges you have to deal with are kind of unique to a school district, and so a private transportation expert wouldn't necessarily be the person who would be as knowledgeable about what we're doing. The person we did have, Henry Kay, who I can't think what Henry Kay's company is.
RK&K.
RK&K. He has worked both in the public sector and the private sector, so that's somebody who has great expertise in both sides, and so they kind of know that he was very helpful in terms of thinking through solutions because he has that context from both sides.
So there's probably about 5 or 6 recommendations that the group landed on throughout. As we went through the work group sessions, things emerged and we started developing and thinking about recommendations. 3 have been somewhat initiated. We are looking to reduce the number of bell schedules. We have done a solicitation, a competitive bid for a consultant to help us with a reconfiguration of our bell schedules.
Has that been awarded?
No. we have a proposal that we're going to bring to y'all, to the board.
Okay.
For approval. Like I mentioned, we did restructure the yellow bus contract to improve our invoicing, our monitoring of invoices. The previous contract, which had been in existence for a number of years, included time, which was the travel time of the bus, which is a very tough measure to consistently rely on because of traffic, because of bus breakdowns and waiting at schools to pick students up and to drop students off. There's just a lot of variables. So we took the time element out and we focus now just strictly on mileage, which is an easier thing to measure from our Edulog routing system. So we use that as sort of our criteria upon which to compare our invoices. So the contractor submit an invoice with miles, we compare that against what we thought the bus should run, and we reconcile those differences. And that's been I believe it's been an improvement on what we can say we've paid and what contractors have invoiced us for. And also there's been a big effort along that restructuring of the yellow bus contract that Jacinta has done and her team with collecting what we call liquidated damages. So if a bus is late, there's a damage for that. We take money out of the contractor's invoice. If there's a route that they didn't run, and we take that from their invoice and other things that have to do with compliance with the contract. So that's some work we've initiated. And then we've also we have a GPS system installed. We have a student boarding module that we're implementing, and in that module we would like to do a bus driver and attendant scan system, which would sort of authenticate and validate, was that driver certified, did they do that route on that day that we are getting an invoice for. So those are things that are initiated now. Things for further consideration, recommendations, we want to, a lot of it, the transportation is where does the student live, and what that drives the miles and the cost is where the student lives and where they go to school. The work group thinks it would be a good idea to dig into how our programs are distributed across the city and what the implications are for transportation, and if any adjustments can be done to reduce that travel time and distance for our students. And then also, choice was a recurring theme and question from our work group stakeholders that would come up. What is choice about? Why do you do choice? That seems to be, not a good thing for transportation. And we brought in a session. In one of our sessions, we had some families speak to the work group and their experience with transportation. And what came up, one of the items, again, came up was choice, and some of the work group, or some of the parents talked about, that they felt like their child was better off at another school because that school had the skill set there to take care of their child that maybe the school that was closer, that looked similar, didn't have. And that really, I think it opened the group's eyes to, the value of, a parent saying, I believe my child's better off there, and giving them that choice. So we thought that, a way to get information to families is for them to consider, where we live, where the programs are, and what is the distance before they make a decision and then realize that, wow, that's taken a long time for, that's quite a time for my child to be on the bus. It's to try to get that information to them beforehand. And that's what that one initiative is. So those bottom two we want to look at too for further consideration.
Commissioner Richardson and I were on the enrollment work group, and why am I bringing that up? This transportation didn't really make the discussion, but what you're describing improves the experience of parents and kids, and this is all part of making life better, the Baltimore City School experience better, and making it harder to leave the district because you're doing things that will make it easier for kids to get home and to school. So I really want to commend you on this work.
Good, thanks.
It's really important for keeping families in the district?
It educated the whole entire group on that aspect, that encounter with the parents. And then we're working on our policy and regulations. We've come to the policy committee with those. We've vetted them with a number of stakeholder groups, the parent, PCAB, CCAC we've been to twice. We've shown them to administrators. The charter group is looking over them. But we have also sent them to the State Department of Education to look at, because they have a nationally recognized expert on transportation policy. And she happens to work closely with us. And she's reviewed those and continuing to review those. And so there's some adjustments in the language that we're undertaking that we're hoping to get to get these to the board soon.
All right, so on slide 9 with ongoing improvements, as John mentioned, we are looking to start a bell study to improve our bell times, because as we currently stand, we have 11 a.m. bell times and 22 p.m. bell times. So that makes it very difficult to tier our buses. And a little over 70% of all of our students are dropped off at school between 7:45 and 8:15. So that limits the number of buses that we can use more than once, because they're all being used around the same time. So to pilot this, we've started looking at swing space schools for next year, and we tiered them between 3 bell times, 7:30, 8:30, and 9:30. So that's going to allow us to transport much more swing space students with less buses.
The first bell would be at 9:30 in some cases? What does
Yes.
that mean? Yeah?
Yes.
The last bell would be at 9:30. The first
The-
bell would be
I
7:30.
got you right.
You're right. The second school we would take at 8:30, and then the third school we would take at 9:30.
So students in those schools would report by
Three.
9:30.
3 different schools.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yes.
Right.
And some of it is we're forced in this situation because there's just not enough buses to go around.
Question.
I was just saying I'd rather be in the 9:30.
Right.
Yeah.
So this year we did it with Baybrook, and it worked out pretty well for
Very
us to utilize the buses. So
What's the last bell for the 9:30 kids?
you mean at dismissal
Yeah.
time, 3:40?
Oh, okay.
So for the budget proposal, we're working on a 5-year cost analysis of increasing the in-house fleet, which would allow us to operate a lot more buses than what we currently have, as well as increase driver salaries. That's one thing that we've always pushed, that we can't look to increase the in-house fleet until we raise our driver salary, because currently we have counties in Maryland with a lower cost of living that pays their drivers $5 to $6 more than we pay ours. So increasing driver salaries, in our opinion, should happen either simultaneously or before we look to increase our fleet. And as well as hire additional bus staff. With the current salary, we have managed to hire additional staff. We still have some vacancies, but we're working to fill them as we speak. Something we're looking to do is put bus cameras on our buses, inside and out. We have been working with legal on what that would look like. Right now, Baltimore City does not have a ordinance that supports bus cameras on the outside that would produce tickets, but that is something that we have to work on to make happen. GPS on taxi cabs, we don't have that now, but that's something that we're looking to do next year. This will allow us to see where all of the cabs that serve Baltimore City students are, what time they got to schools, and et cetera. And it'll also help us with accident investigation, because it tells us speed of the vehicle at the time of the accident. Soliciting additional yellow bus contractors, we are currently doing. This is a challenge, but something that has to be done, at least until we get our in-house fleet numbers to where we need them to be, and the analysis of special education placement, especially for our younger students who are living a, long distance from where they attend school. Even though in some cases in a vehicle like a car, they can get to school from their home in about 20 to 25 minutes. When you put that student on a yellow bus going to other parts of the city, picking up other kids, that 25-minute drive can turn into an hour and a half easily. Review of routing taxi riders in our routing system that's called Edgelog is something that we are looking to do potentially next year, because right now how that looks is we assign students to the taxi cab companies and they route them according to the drivers they have, but we are looking to route them in-house, give the cab companies the routes and just have them select the driver. And lastly, board-approved transportation policies is in the pipeline for ongoing improvements. And that concludes our presentation. Any questions?
I don't have any because it was a particularly thorough and informative report, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next up, procurement.
Good morning. I'm Joe Vogel from Procurement. There are 7 items on the agenda today. Would you like me to go through them and summarize real quick, or would you just go to your questions? Or
What do you
Can
prefer?
you go through them for me?
yes, Okay, the first item requests the board's approval of a charter school lease agreement between the city schools and Baltimore Curriculum Project at the Frederick Elementary School. The total annual rental is $305,307. It's based on a square footage rate of $3.82 a square foot, and the contract includes an annual increase of 4% thereafter. Okay. The second, request the board's approval to accept $475,000 from Major League Baseball's Youth Development Foundation to construct an athletic complex in partnership with the Cal Ripken Senior Foundation at Frederick Douglass High School. The estimated project cost is $2.2 million, with Cal Ripken Foundation making up the difference over this $475,000. Project is expected to be completed by end of April of 2019.
When you say the difference, you mean the district will fund the rest?
Blaine Lipsky with operations. No, Cal Ripken Foundation is funding the entire project. We did back last year contribute $30,000 from the facilities operation budget when they came last year and discussed the plans to proceed with this project. And then we entered into an MOU and we provided $30,000 out of our operating budget. But Cal Ripken, it's going to be called the Brooks Robinson Field. Brooks Robinson and his other donors will be providing the full balance of the installation and field installation.
Just to be perfectly clear, so other than the 30,000, the field will be entirely privately funded. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
And congratulations. That's great.
Next item requests the board's approval of a competitively bid contract with Autumn Contracting in a total amount of $2,086,700 to provide roof replacement services at Brems Lane Elementary School.
Sorry. Allison, we own that building. I know a charter school's in there now. Brems Lane. That's our building.
Yes, it's our building, and the charter school's in it, but this is, but improvements that are capital improvements. The school has a lease, the operator has a lease that's a utilities-only lease, where so regular maintenance they provide, but any capital improvements, they're part of the CIP and they go through our process.
The next item requests the board's approval of a competitively bid contract with Chilmar Corporation in a total amount of $429,396 to provide elevator replacement construction services at Western High School. The next item requests the board's approval to increase a contract with Chilmar Corporation by $130,000 to complete the construction of the fire safety system at James McHenry.
What's the source of the 130,000?
Local, Cindy Smith with Design and Construction. It's local capital funding.
Again, remind me, is that a contingency or is it taken from another project? Usually, I thought,
So for this one, it would be taken from just the general local capital that's allocated to all the projects across the board, but we do have some from that city, contingency from projects that have been under budget and things in the past.
Okay. The next item requests the board's approval to increase the contract with Towson Mechanical by $250,000 to complete the construction of the HVAC system at Lakewood Early Learning Center. Thank you. And the last item requests the board's approval to piggyback a Baltimore County Public Schools competitively solicited contract with Ready Fresh to provide water cooler and bottled water service. The estimated annual amount is $800,000. The contract term is April 1 of 2019 through June 30th of 2021. Okay, thank you.
okay, thanks, everybody. I don't have the day of the next meeting, do you?
It would be this day a month from now, right? The 19th of March.
The next meeting of the Operations Committee will be on March 19th. Have a great day.
Thank you.